long shadow of human history, few stories cut so deep and so quietly as this one. A family who disappeared from society and began consuming it. For 25 years, travelers vanished along the remote Scottish coast. No bodies, no witnesses, no clues. It was no ghost story, no myth. What investigators found, hidden in the coastal cliffs of Galloway, would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in Britain's history. A sprawling cave, a family of nearly 50, and evidence of systematic cannibalism on a scale no one thought possible. This is the true story of the Bean clan. The year was 1400. Scotland stood on a knife's edge, caught between crumbling medieval traditions and the first flickers of Renaissance thought. Political instability cracked the foundations of authority. The law barely reached into the countryside. And in this perfect storm of disorder, one man emerged, not as a madman or myth, but as a predator shaped by the chaos around him. His name was Alexander Sawney Bean. Born into poverty in East Lothian, Bean grew up resenting the society that rejected him. But while most outcasts slipped into petty crime or disappeared into the margins, Bean dreamed bigger, darker. He didn't want to bend society to his will. He wanted to erase it to build something monstrous in its place. That vision found its echo in Agnes Douglas, a woman already feared for whispers of witchcraft and murder. Their union wasn't a romance. It was a convergence of something far more sinister. Together, they vanished from the civilized world, not to escape judgment, but to create a world where their appetites would reign unchecked. And they found it deep within the hidden caves along the Galloway coast, a place where cries vanished into stone, and where the sea itself erased all trace of sin. What began in shadows would grow into a nightmare that lasted a quarter of a century. One soaked in blood, fear, and flesh, and no one saw it coming. Alexander Sawney Bean wasn't born into horror, but it didn't take long for horror to find him. Raised in the harsh poverty of East Lothian, Bean grew up on the outside of everything. Unwanted by the ruling class, untouched by education, and uninfluenced by morality. But unlike the usual highway thieves or starving vagabonds who drifted through Scotland's lawless margins, Bean didn't simply want to survive. He wanted to reject the world entirely, to create a reality where the rules of humanity held no meaning. That dream took shape the moment he met Agnes Douglas, a woman whose name was already carried in hushed tones and dark rumors. People called her a witch. Some claimed she'd murdered her own kin. Others swore she'd made pacts with unclean spirits. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. What mattered was this. She and Bean recognized in each other something terrifying, a shared hunger. Their union wasn't forged by love or desperation. It was a pact. A bond between two people who believed the world was weak, and who saw cruelty not as a failure of the soul, but as a kind of purity. Together they vanished, not fleeing danger, but hunting freedom. Civilization, with its laws and morals, had nothing to offer them. What they needed was isolation, a place where their desires could fester, evolve, and multiply. They found that place on the storm-blasted coastline of Galloway. There, tucked between jagged cliffs and thundering waves, was a cave system that stretched nearly a mile into the earth. To the outside world, it was just rock. But to the Beans, it was the blueprint for a kingdom built on secrecy and flesh. The cave's entrance vanished with every high tide, hiding its existence from the casual traveler. Inside, it split into winding chambers like a living organism, dark arteries leading deeper into the unknown. It offered shelter, camouflage, and something even more valuable, silence. Here, Alexander and Agnes laid the foundations of something far beyond crime. In this pit of damp stone and perpetual darkness, they planted the seeds of a new society, one where murder was tradition and cannibalism was law, and they were just getting started. The first victims were never missed. Solitary travelers, nameless pilgrims, wandering merchants, the kind of people whose disappearances could be blamed on wolves, weather, or highwaymen. They were easy prey, but But what happened to them inside that cave defied all natural explanation. Alexander and Agnes didn't simply rob and kill. They devoured. At first, it may have been desperation, hunger, survival, the cruel logic of isolation. But over time, something changed. Cannibalism stopped being necessity. It became ritual. Human flesh turned sacred, a cornerstone of their twisted new life. Nothing was wasted, no trace left behind. As Agnes gave birth, again and again, the cave filled not just with bodies, but with children. And these weren't ordinary children. Born in pitch darkness, raised far from the world of daylight and conscience. They knew nothing beyond what their parents taught them. They never saw the sun. They never heard a stranger's voice. Their lullabies were the screams of dying victims. From infancy, they were molded into predators. They learned to move silently in total darkness, to track human prey by scent, and to butcher bodies with surgical skill. Their only education was in survival, dismemberment, and the sacred duty of loyalty to the clan. In this suffocating isolation, incest wasn't taboo, it was tradition. Sons took sisters. Mothers bore children from their own blood. It wasn't accident. It was design. Bean believed that sealing his bloodline from the outside world preserved its purity. Over time, his descendants became more than feral, they became other. Generation after generation, the children grew more detached from anything remotely human. Their empathy eroded. Their instincts sharpened. They weren't monsters by birth, but monsters by nurture, sculpted into something primal by their environment. As their numbers swelled, so did their efficiency. No longer a couple picking off stragglers, the clan had become a machine. They ambushed with military precision, striking quickly and dragging the living, always the living, back to the cave. Some died fast. Others were kept alive for days, butchered bit by bit to preserve freshness. The cave adapted with them. It became a grotesque homestead, walls lined with hooks for hanging limbs, chambers for salting flesh, and alcoves for smoking meat. Body parts were sorted like butchered livestock. Torsos here, arms there, heads preserved, labeled, and sometimes displayed like trophies. To outsiders, it was unimaginable. But to the Bean clan, it was home. It was family. It was normal. As the clan's numbers grew, so did their appetite for flesh and for power. What began as silent ambushes of lone travelers evolved into something terrifyingly methodical. They studied routes, watched patterns, and learned to anticipate their prey with almost military precision. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy. Entire caravans began to vanish. Merchant parties, sometimes with guards and wagons, would simply disappear into the mist of Galloway's coastal paths. No blood trails, no horses, no bodies, just absence and silence. The Bean clan had perfected the art of the human hunt. Their coordination was almost unnatural. Attacks happened with brutal speed. A distraction at the front, a flank in the shadows, a retreat into the fog. By the time anyone realized what was happening, they were already being dragged toward the cave. And the cave was ready. Preservation became a sacred skill. Meat was smoked, salted, and stored with care. Different chambers were designated for different preparations. Hooks lined the walls. Fires were kept low and slow. They weren't just eating to survive, they were storing, rationing, planning. Their cave had become a grotesque pantry that rivaled the organization of any noble's kitchen. Every part of the body had a purpose. Limbs were easier to process. Torsos gave volume. Heads were often kept for ritual. To the outside world, these acts would be unthinkable. But to the Beans, it was structure, order, tradition. Their children had never known any other world. For them, this wasn't madness. It was life. And as they matured, their instincts grew more dangerous. They developed a near supernatural sense for tracking. They could smell sweat on the wind, hear footsteps through stone, communicate with grunts and echoes like cave-dwelling predators. No storybooks, no religion, no guilt, just survival. Their hunting grounds expanded as confidence turned into arrogance. They pushed farther inland, striking villages, abducting entire families, leaving behind only empty homes and scattered rumors. Scotland's southern coast became a graveyard with no graves. The fear spread faster than facts ever could. People spoke of demons, witches, forest spirits. They couldn't accept the truth that it was people doing this. Flesh and blood. A family hiding in the cliffs, preying on the living like livestock. Even among the clan there were stories, superstitions, whispers that the bloodline had changed, that some children had gone too far, that certain cravings were becoming uncontrollable. Still, no one dared speak against the family. Dissent meant weakness, and weakness was dealt with like everything else, efficiently. The Beans didn't think of themselves as evil. They believed the world beyond the cave was broken. They weren't criminals. They were the last survivors of a dying age, purified by blood, bonded by hunger, and driven by one rule above all. The clan comes first, always. As the clan's confidence surged, their caution eroded. Their hunts grew bolder, their targets more ambitious. The secrecy that had protected them for decades began to unravel, not because they were discovered, but because they no longer feared being caught, and that arrogance would be their undoing. Communities began noticing patterns. Travel routes once considered safe became feared corridors of disappearance. Entire families vanished without a trace. Wagons were found abandoned. Bones appeared in riverbeds, and still no one could explain why or how. Fear took root in the Scottish countryside, not as a sudden panic, but a slow, creeping dread. The whispers began quietly, passed between travelers at roadside inns. Some blamed highwaymen, others feared wolves. A few spoke of something darker, beasts in the cliffs, demons from the sea, cursed spirits haunting the roads. But none of them imagined the truth, that the terror wasn't supernatural. It was human. Trade suffered. Pilgrims began traveling in larger groups, escorted by armed men. Certain routes were avoided altogether. The economic arteries of the region began to clot. Markets faltered. Towns grew quiet. Local magistrates heard the rumors but dismissed them. Disappearances were common in medieval Scotland, and banditry was rampant. Wild animals, river crossings, weather, all common causes of death. The idea that a coordinated group was hunting humans for food was too absurd to believe. Church leaders tried to make sense of it in spiritual terms. They spoke of divine punishment, of Satan's work, of judgment upon sinners. Vigils were held. Pilgrimages were made. Still, people vanished. No one suspected that the source of this evil was hiding in plain sight, buried within the coastal stone, just beyond the reach of justice. The Bean clan's reign of terror now stretched across regions. Their attacks, once isolated and rare, had become systematic. They didn't just strike and flee. They studied their targets, sometimes trailing them for days. They began hitting noble families, clergy, traders with royal contracts. And that's when the whispers reached the ears of the crown. The scale of the disappearances, the consistency, the geographic concentration, could no longer be ignored. Local legends were dismissed no longer as fantasy, but as smoke rising from a very real fire. The horror had become too widespread, too persistent, and too devastating to the kingdom's stability to leave unchallenged. A reckoning was coming, but even then, no one truly understood what they were about to uncover, because the truth wasn't just worse than the rumors. It was something Scotland had never seen before, and would never forget again. The horror finally reached the throne. At first, King James I treated the rumors as noise, local hysteria born from ignorance and fear. Scotland was already straining under rebellions, banditry, and border skirmishes. Vanished travelers? That was the cost of untamed lands. But then the disappearances began to touch the crown's coffers. Merchant caravans tied to royal trade routes were vanishing. Nobles returning from court never arrived. Tax collectors stopped reporting. The numbers were no longer random. They were patterns, dense clusters of silence, all radiating from a single region, the Galloway coast. Suddenly, this wasn't folklore. It was a threat to the kingdom's stability. A royal commission was launched, its task simple: find the truth no matter how strange. Court scribes began compiling records of the missing, stretching back decades. The list grew into a catalog of absence. Farmers, clergy, merchants, messengers, children. 1,000 names. And no answers. But maps don't lie. And when the investigators laid all the disappearances side by side, the shape became clear. A perimeter of death, all pointing inward. The Crown dispatched scouts, veterans of brutal wars along the English border. They weren't told what to expect, only that something was killing the realm from within. What they found defied expectation entirely. It began with a hunt. A royal party chasing deer near the cliffs noticed the tide shifting strangely against a rocky outcrop. One tracker, curious, followed the current and saw an opening, half submerged, pulsing with water. It wasn't just a cave. It was an entrance, hidden by the sea, visible only for hours each day. And from deep within they heard voices. At first they thought it was wind, but it wasn't. It was conversation, human voices, echoing through stone. They had found it. No longer a rumor, no longer a myth. The hunters returned with torches and blades, crawling into the black, uncertain of what lay ahead. What they uncovered would haunt them until their final breaths. Chambers carved by time, now stained by something darker. Bones underfoot, skulls lining the walls, smoke rising from cooking pits still warm. It was not a lair. It was a system organized, deliberate, and utterly inhuman in its purpose. Hooks held what should never have been butchered. Flesh was sorted, dried, preserved. This wasn't panic or madness. It was industry. The silence of centuries was broken. The cave had been found, and the kingdom would never be the same again. What the royal soldiers found inside the cave wasn't just shocking. It was reality-breaking. The entrance widened into a yawning void of smoke and rot. As torchlight cut through the blackness, it revealed a space that defied all understanding of civilization. Bones, countless bones, were scattered like refuse. Skulls piled in corners. Limbs dangling from hooks hammered into rock. The smell was overwhelming. Rot, fire, blood, and waste clung to the walls. Grown men, veterans of war, executioners, guards hardened by death, staggered outside and vomited into the surf. But the deeper they went, the worse it became. This wasn't a den. It was a system, a grotesque mockery of order. Slaughtering chambers, smoking pits, shelves carved into stone where body parts were sorted by stage of preparation. Arms and legs hung like sides of pork. Torsos were arranged by size. Heads, hundreds of them, lined a ledge like trophies. Some fresh, some charred, some hollowed. And then they heard breathing. From the shadows emerged the clan. 48 figures. Men, women, children, pale as bone, eyes reflecting torchlight like nocturnal beasts, hair matted, skin stretched tight by a life without sunlight. They didn't attack. They didn't scream. They simply stared, expressionless, like animals confused by sudden light. The soldiers, stunned, said nothing. And then Agnes stepped forward. She was ancient. Her voice was warped by time and isolation. The dialect twisted into something barely human. Yet her tone carried authority. Her words, delivered without guilt or fear, were not pleas for mercy. They were statements of disbelief. Disbelief that anyone would challenge the life she had built. She did not beg. She explained. To her, this wasn't horror. This was heritage. What followed wasn't a trial. King James I made that clear. These were not subjects of the crown. They were creatures outside the realm of law. Beings who had rejected every human principle so completely that justice, in its usual form, was meaningless. Execution would be immediate. The men were first, hands and feet severed, left to bleed slowly while the women and children were forced to watch. Then came the pyres. Fires set high and hot, consuming the next generation before they could ever pass their nightmare on. Witnesses described their reactions as alien. No weeping, no rage, Some children stared into the flames with quiet curiosity. The mothers did not scream. The fathers did not curse. There was no defiance, no remorse, only silence. Even the executioners were shaken. Men who had broken bones and burned heretics struggled to finish the work. This wasn't justice. It was exorcism. And when the final flames died, something deeper lingered. Not relief, but the unsettling sense that something beyond comprehension had just been erased. Something that had never truly belonged in the world of men. The execution ended the Bean clan's physical existence, but their legacy refused to die. What had begun as whispers became historical fact. The sheer scale of their crimes, hundreds of victims over 25 years, left a scar across Scotland's conscience. And yet, the reaction wasn't triumph. It was unease. This wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. Legal scholars of the time were divided. King James I's decision to bypass trial, to sentence without defense or deliberation, challenged the very idea of justice. But others argued, how could laws made for men apply to something raised in darkness, outside civilization, beyond morality? The court records were minimal, but the royal decree was absolute. The Bean clan had placed themselves so far outside the human order that they no longer qualified for its protections. In a time already accustomed to brutality, this stood out, not for its violence but for the cold, surgical finality of it. And yet, the deeper horror lay not in what the Beans had done, but in what they revealed. The cave wasn't just a crime scene. It was a mirror. It showed what could happen when society fails, when isolation, poverty, and fear replace education, morality, and community. The Beans weren't born as monsters. They were made, over time, by a world that had forgotten them. Religious leaders called it divine punishment, proof of what happens when people stray from God's path. They preached sermons warning against the breakdown of faith and family, pointing to the Beans as the ultimate cautionary tale. But others saw something worse, a collapse of human conscience in the absence of structure. Psychologists centuries later would use the case to study inherited trauma, social conditioning, and extreme isolation. The children especially posed haunting questions. Were they guilty of murder or simply programmed to kill? Can a person raised without love, without empathy, without ever seeing a world beyond survival, be judged by the standards of those who have? It was this question that lingered most. Not just how the Bean clan lived, but what they became. Because their story wasn't only about blood and darkness. It was about failure, of justice, of institutions, of neighbors who looked away for too long. The cave was sealed, its entrances collapsed, its memory buried. But its warning remains. Civilization is not guaranteed. It is built, protected, and preserved, or it vanishes. And in its absence, something else takes root. Something ancient, something cold, something that waits in silence, until the world forgets to keep watching. Centuries have passed since the Bean clan vanished into ash and legend. And yet, their shadow lingers. The tale has been reshaped over time, retold in ballads, twisted in fiction, exaggerated in ghost stories. But at its core, the story remains the same. A family consumed by isolation, transformed by desperation, and erased by a justice system that could no longer recognize them as human. Historians debate the details. Archaeologists argue over bones and cave sites. Some suggest the Beans never existed at all, that their legacy is a patchwork of scattered crimes, sewn together by fear. But the truth is simpler. Something happened in those caves. Something real. Something terrifying enough that even now, we struggle to look it directly in the eye. Because the Bean clan forces us to ask the question we least want to face. How thin is the line between us and them? Are we civilized because of what's inside us, or because of the world we've built around us? What happens when that world breaks? The Beans didn't haunt Scotland as ghosts. They haunted it as a reflection of everything that can collapse when society turns its back on the vulnerable, when justice waits too long, when fear becomes silence. Their cave has long since been sealed, but others still exist, hidden not beneath cliffs but inside systems, in broken homes, in abandoned communities, in forgotten places where suffering festers in the dark. That's what makes their story unforgettable. Not because it ended, but because it never really did.